Tension is running high in occupied East Jerusalem after Israel stormed the al-Aqsa mosque during prayers. Many Palestinians were then forced from their homes and dozens killed in Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. As Palestinian anger grows, could we see a third uprising? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem. Ahelbarra. Tensions have been simmering for weeks in occupied East Jerusalem. But on Monday, the situation took a dangerous turn when Israeli police stormed the al-Aqsa mosque compound, injuring hundreds of Palestinians. The armed group Hamas responded by firing rockets into Israel, which in turn sparked the airstrikes on Gaza. More than 24 Palestinians were killed, among them 9 children in the Israeli attacks. And at least 2 Israeli women were killed by the rockets. Hamas had warned it would act after the raid on al-Aqsa, when Israeli police used rubber bullets, stun grenades and tear gas. Occupied East Jerusalem had been on edge anyway, because Palestinian families are being threatened with eviction from their homes. Israeli settlers have waged legal battles in an attempt to force the Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Al Jazeera's correspondents have been following the developments on both sides of the conflict. We start with Harry Fawcett from Damascus Gate in occupied East Jerusalem.
Well, these simmering tensions, this violence, it all really began with the situation here at the beginning of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan on the steps of Damascus Gate. The decision by the Israeli security forces to block it off to the usual kind of gatherings that we see nightly during Ramadan. It was a real source of anger, a source of protest and skirmishes between Palestinians and the Israeli security forces. All of that fueled and magnified by what was taking place in a nearby neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, where there was the imminent threat of evictions on Palestinian families who'd been living there for generations. And all of that boiling over on Monday, those scenes we saw on the al-Aqsa mosque compound, courtyards, those very violent scenes with Israeli security forces moving in great numbers, and of course leading to that deadline given by Hamas for a complete withdrawal by the Israeli forces by 6 p.m. local time on Monday. Just after that, the launching of 7 long-range rockets on the Jerusalem area. For Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that that was crossing a red line and required a forceful response. We're seeing that forceful response now, and the Israeli government is promising that it will last for days. As well as that, as the death toll mounts inside Gaza, wave after wave of rocket fire coming out from inside the territory itself. So it's an extremely volatile situation, and also worth mentioning something that's being less reported: the spread of violent protest to Palestinian, Israeli and mixed towns. There is a real danger of that violence continuing to spread throughout Israel, turning into potential inter-community violence. We've seen one instance of that already, with a Palestinian killed by gunfire by a Jew. We're talking about civilian against civilian inside an Israeli town overnight. That's an extremely dangerous and volatile situation itself. Harry Fawcett for Inside Story in occupied East Jerusalem.
Nida Ibrahim reports from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
There have been several calls for protests in different cities in the occupied West Bank, and we've seen some of them head to confrontation points with the Israeli army, such as Israeli military checkpoints in the occupied West Bank. We know that East Jerusalem and Gaza are separated from the occupied West Bank by Israeli military checkpoints that Palestinians would need permits to be able to go to. So they wanted to show their anger and say that even though they can't be with their fellow Palestinians physically, they are doing what they can because they believe that they are living in the same plight under the same Israeli occupation and its measures. We've seen a lot of frustration among Palestinians when it comes to how the Palestinian Authority is dealing with the latest escalation. They believe they've given a very soft stance And this is why this position was manifested in some of the protests we've seen in Ramallah. One of the protests we've seen officials holding hands, walking in the protest, while the younger generation was leaving a gap between them. It was a deliberate gap to show that they are not following their leadership. When we asked some of the Palestinians if they know that there's an Arab League meeting on Tuesday, many of them told us that they don't even care to know because they believe that the Arabs have failed them and they are left to fight the Israeli occupation on their own.
Countries worldwide have appealed for a de-escalation of tensions. While Western capitals have called for the violence to stop, they've hit out at Hamas for its rocket attacks. The UN held an emergency meeting, but no statement was issued. The head of the Arab League condemned the violence by Israel against Palestinians and its attacks on Gaza. Jordan described Jerusalem as, quote, a red line and called for an end to provocative measures. Turkey called on world leaders to take effective action against what it called Israeli terror. Let's bring in our guests in Ramallah. Saleh Hijazi is Deputy Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International in Tel Aviv. Yaakov Amidror, former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel and former Major General. Also in Ramallah, Noor Ouda, political analyst and founding member of the Democratic National Assembly. Welcome to the program. Saleh, the events which continue to unfold at this particular moment, is this something that could be contained by all the parties, or do you see the situation spinning out of control now?
Well, I would say it could be contained if we can break the circle of impunity that has been existing in Israel and occupied territories for many years. We have a great opportunity, historic opportunity, with the International Criminal Court opening an investigation into the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. This could be a new chapter for what happens in Israel and occupied territories, whereby international law and the respect for human rights can be front and center into how things go on the ground and how the international community deals with the situation. The recent events are very worrying because they are reminiscent of what happened in 2014 in Gaza, which could arguably be said that the most devastating and destructive Israeli military operation in the occupied Palestinian territories, wreaking major havoc among civilian life and the population there. It is extremely worrying. The only reason this could happen, and we could see the violations continue, is because there is impunity. There's no accountability for the continuous human rights and international law violations.
Yaakov, by storming the al-Aqsa mosque compound, firing rubber bullets, stun grenades, tear gas inside the mosque, what was Israel trying to achieve when you know these are very important, religiously speaking, moments for Muslims all over the world and for Palestinians in particular?
As you know, this is the holiest place for Jews. It's the Temple Mountain. It's the temple, the Jewish temple was there almost 1700 years before the Islam came to Jerusalem. So from the Jewish point of view, this is the holiest place for us. And if the Palestinians would not begin rioting, throwing stones into the Wailing Wall, trying to prevent Jews from visiting the holy place for the Jews, the police would not come in. It's a very quiet place many days during the year. And if the Palestinians do not initiating such rioting, such attitude towards the Jews who are praying down near the Wailing Wall, I don't see the police doing anything. So the initiation of all this event was done by the Palestinians against the Jews in Jerusalem. And remember, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and was Jewish city 2,000 years before Islam came to this area.
Okay, I see your point. Noor, it's the Palestinians who are to blame.
Well, of course, if you're the colonizer and you were brutalizing Palestinians day in and day out for over 50 years, sure, there's no way you're going to find fault with the brutality of Israeli police on a daily basis, much less an attack on al-Aqsa mosque compound. Having said that, I think it was very clear to the entire world what was happening, and that's why we saw blanket condemnation of these Israeli measures. We saw blanket condemnation as well of the racist marches of Israeli settlers who are completely unhinged and protected by Israeli soldiers, marching through occupied Jerusalem, chanting death to Arabs. So the provocations, the sparks of this escalation have, they were there, they were accumulating over days, specifically throughout the month of Ramadan, when even the access of Palestinian Jerusalemites to areas they traditionally go to after breaking their fast, like the Damascus Gate, was restricted. The writing was all over the wall, but because of very petty political calculus, it was allowed to continue. These are the allies of Benjamin Netanyahu, and he wanted to show them that he's still their friend. And now we are where we are because of all of that.
Saleh, the focal point of the discontent, which soon degenerated into a wider confrontation, was Sheikh Jarrah, where families are facing evictions. Now, there is a hearing which is expected by the Israeli Supreme Court. Do you see an outcome that could potentially change because of the latest developments on the ground?
Unless Israel dismantles that discriminatory system that it imposes on Palestinians, no outcome would be positive. There's been continuous dispossession of Palestinians. For example, Sheikh Jarrah is a great story. This is not the first time that Palestinians are evicted from their homes to make place for settlers. East Jerusalem is an occupied city. Its population, the Palestinian population there, is protected under international humanitarian law. And since 1967, when Israel illegally annexed that part of the city, it has pursued policies of demographic engineering, which translated into forced displacement of Palestinians and the expansion and building of illegal settlements on the other side. Forced displacement means the demolition of Palestinian homes, restricting how much they can plan and build, and the residency revocation, basically pushing them out of this territory. Unless international law, human rights are front and center to how Israel and the international community deals with the Palestinian population there and that part of the city, the occupied East Jerusalem, we will see a continuous violation of rights and unfortunately, a continuous forced displacement of the Palestinian population there.
Yaakov, the expropriation of land for the settlers has been denounced by the UN, by the international institutions. Do you see the next government in Israel changing course?
Look, Israel is a state with law, unlike many countries in the Middle East. They appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will make a decision. I don't know when, and I don't know what will be the decision. It's in the hand of the court. And in Israel, we obey the law, and if the decision of the Supreme Court will be that we should let the Palestinians to continue to live in these houses, they will. If the decision of the Supreme Court will be that they have to leave the place because it belongs to other people who apply to the court, they will have to leave. It's a legal issue between the two groups. One is saying it's mine, and the other one is saying, no, it's mine. And both appealed to the court. And at the end, it will be decided by the court. Israel is a state in which, when the court made a decision, and you never know before the court make the decision what the decision will be, that will be obeyed by, at least by the authorities in Israel, no question about it. So I don't know. And it very much depends what will happen in the court. I have one remark about the issue of settlers that are taking place of Arabs in East Jerusalem. Ironically, and it's almost impossible by nature, the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem is bigger now. Much more Palestinians are living now in East Jerusalem than in '67. So if those people who spoke were out about the policy of, taking the places of the Palestinians by settlers and so on and so forth, all these accusations which do not connect it to the reality. How it is that the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem is growing all the time, and Palestinians from the West Bank want to move into Jerusalem. The situation of the Palestinians in Jerusalem is so bad, while so many Palestinians are immigrating from the West Bank into Jerusalem and ask to have Israeli papers. So there is,
all right, but I just,
the reality.
I feel like
Sorry. No, you didn't stop. You didn't stop the two other guys. So don't stop me, please.
Go ahead.
It is ironic that what they describe is against the reality on the ground.
Yes, but I just have to remind you that the housing projects in Sheikh Jarrah was started in 1956, and then there was an agreement between Jordan and the UN to hand over ownership of those places to the Palestinians back in the 60s. Come 67 and things changed on the ground. Go ahead.
With all due respect, asked me a question and I answered, and you didn't answer. You didn't ask them. You asked me.
No.
So it is my view. The number of Palestinians in Jerusalem is growing all the time because Palestinians are immigrating from the West Bank into Jerusalem. They are right. And the situation of the Palestinians in Jerusalem is so bad. Why do they immigrating from the West Bank into Jerusalem?
Noah, is this going to be purely legal or a political battle, particularly as far as the case of Sheikh Jarrah is concerned?
No, this is. I mean, anyways, the Israeli courts are part and parcel of the regime of colonial occupation, and report after report, study after study prove that they are no more than tools to provide cover for the dispossession of Palestinians and the systematic discrimination against Palestinians. We have yet to see a court rule in favor of Palestinian families fighting for their property. Israel legislates laws to ensure that Palestinians are discriminated against, while Israeli settlers and settler organizations can claim land and property belonging to Palestinians. Palestinians who actually have legitimate claim and deeds of their property cannot do the same in what is now recognized as Israel proper. So the argument is a bit upside down, but again, that's not surprising given the fact that we're talking about, a colonial regime trying to market itself when it is so clearly exposed for what it is. The issue in Jerusalem is not one of a real estate dispute. It's one of a colonial occupation. There is occupier and occupied. Denying that fact, making it look otherwise doesn't change the fact. That is the fact. Palestinians are in Jerusalem, of course. Their numbers are increasing. Well, we have families just like all other humans. But at the end of the day, we're not in Jerusalem because life is good and Israel is treating us well. We're in Jerusalem because that's our homeland. And we have every right to stay, and we have every right to move freely between Jerusalem and Palestinian cities. It's not immigration, it's the right to freedom of movement.
Let's move forward because we have different angles to cover. Saleh, the muted international response when it comes to this particular confrontation could be an indication that the world would like to see the Palestinians making compromises for them to be able to move forward. They cannot just be stuck in a mindset about the past.
Well, if it is about the Sheikh Jarrah, it is about basically Palestinians staying in their own homes. What can you change about that? The Palestinians in the Sheikh Jarrah have been displaced already once. What's happening now has already happened in 1948. These families come from Jaffa and Haifa and have been moved and then settled there by the UN Relief and Works Agency. In 2009, 2010, there was a first wave of forced displacement whereby some families were taken out and settlers took over their homes. And we're seeing this again, and we'll see it, carry on later if this, the system of institutionalized discrimination does not stop. There are laws in Israel, and here I'll bring the example of the Entry to Israel law, which treats Palestinians, the original inhabitants of the city, as foreigners, as people who are coming to visit, and prevents, to your guest, it is not right to say that Palestinians from the West Bank are immigrating to the city. There are laws that prevent Palestinians from being able to live where they want. And the entry to Israel law is a stark example of that, where there's clear discrimination against Palestinians in text of the law. If a Palestinian from East Jerusalem is married to a Palestinian from the West Bank, that Palestinian from the West Bank cannot have the right to live in East Jerusalem. The law prevents them from doing that.
Okay. Yaakov, where does it leave the future of the relationship between Israel and Palestine? The international community has been saying that the expansion of settlements is the biggest threat. And this, I'm quoting the EU, which said that this is something that will cause further damage to the prospects for a viable Palestinian state. How do you see the future?
First, we have a law that Palestinians cannot immigrate from the West Bank into Jerusalem because the number of Palestinians who want to move from the West Bank into Jerusalem is such high that it cannot be they cannot be swallowed by Jerusalem area. If they and ask yourself the question why they want to immigrate into Jerusalem if the situation is so bad in Jerusalem. First, second, the issue of the Palestinians-Israeli relation is not new. The Palestinians were against the immigration of Jews into their homeland since the beginning of the 19th century. The Palestinians didn't accept the 47 decision of the United Nations to make here in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean 2 states. That was the beginning of the war in 48, which is ended from the Palestinian point of view with a Nakba and from the Israeli point of view with independence. It's not something new. If the Palestinians will not agree to compromise, and what they want is to destroy Israel, they will never succeed. I heard that you people are saying in Al Jazeera that it is the 13th uprising of the Palestinians. And what they achieved in this 13th uprising, nothing. Why? They're not ready to compromise.
Okay.
The Jews in Israel in 47 said, we don't like the decision of the United Nations. But if for having an independent state and peace between the Palestinians and the Jews, we will have to accept 2 states, we are ready. What the Palestinians said, never a Jewish state, we will destroy you, whatever you will do.
Okay.
So they tried, they didn't succeed, the result is the Nakba, and they can continue to do the same in the future, and they will succeed as well as they succeeded in the past.
No, almost 30 years since the peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the central element of that package was basically that the Americans will be able to play role as a broker. Now with Biden, who seems to be determined this time not to be bogged down in further Middle East conflicts, do you think that the Americans have to rethink their policy in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Well, I think they should. I'm not sure they will, though. I think the Biden administration simply doesn't have the backbone or the interest, really, to realign U.S. policy with international law, to realign U.S. policy with the growing consensus among Americans, especially the constituents of this administration, the Democratic Party, to support Palestinian rights, to support international law, and to reject this blank check for Israeli violations and Israeli actions, and to bankroll these violations as well, to finally condition military aid to Israel, which is a military superpower in the region. All of these things would be in the interest of the American administration. I don't see it happening, although strategically speaking, I see that the trend is moving in the right direction and that more and more U.S. Elected officials are aligning their positions with the moral and the logical way to go, which is to say that there has to be a standard upon which we have relations with countries, and they must apply to all. The exceptionalism that Israel has enjoyed for more than 50 years, that has allowed it to do all of these things, has to stop. And this arrogance with which Palestinians are treated is simply untenable.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but I promise you, Saleh, Hijazi, Yaakov, Amidror, Noor Auda, that we will go back and revisit this particular story as it continues to unfold. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.